Thanks again for joining, everybody. It's really good to see so many of you coming in. And we're really excited to be having our sixth session today in response to the discussion paper that we launched on context and challenges for gender transformative work with men and boys. And this is a paper that we launched late last year at the start of the MenEngage Ubuntu Symposium that this session is part of. And we've been organizing discussions with various experts, giving their perspectives on what's presented in the paper. And today is our sixth session, and we will be focusing on operational contexts, the rationale and accountability, and social change. And what the paper really seeks to do, and what we are seeking to do with having these conversations, is to dig deeper into the engaging men and boys work towards transforming patriarchal masculinities, and look at how we can become part of the broader movement for systems transformation. And the paper really anchors analysis of social political context, economic context, political context, digital context that we talked about last week, and looks at what kind of the broader challenges and issues are that we're facing in the world today, and how the work on engaging men and boys and transforming masculinities can be part of the movements that seeks to dismantle patriarchy and advance human rights and gender justice as part of the broader social justice efforts. So we welcome you all. It's like I said, it's really good to see so many of you joining in. Please do share where you're from and where you're calling in from. Share your name. We would love to have a sense of who's online today with us. And maybe also if this is the first session that you're joining in the discussion paper series, or if you've joined others. And we would love to hear from you throughout the whole session. Any questions that you have, comments, reflections, do you recognize what's being shared in your own context? We would love to hear from you, and I'll also try to bring some of your perspectives in throughout the session and reflect some of your questions back to the speakers. And for those of you who are using social media, this is a session that is being recorded. It will be online in the next couple of days after the session. But in the meantime, we really welcome you to share any quotes that you're hearing or any reflections that you have on what's being said, also via social media. So you can use the hashtag Ubuntu Symposium, or in Spanish, Simposio Ubuntu, on Twitter. And I have the pleasure to introduce our speakers of today. And we are really thankful to be hearing from them. They've all had a look at the paper, and will be sharing their reflections throughout the conversation today. We are joined by Latanya Mapfret. She is the president and CEO of Global Fund for Women, and which works to strengthen gender justice movements to shift power, privilege, and perception, and create meaningful change that will last beyond our lifetimes. As a feminist fund, the Global Fund for Women offers flexible support to a diverse group of partners, with more than 5,000 groups across 170 countries so far. And previously, Latanya was executive director of Planned Parenthood Global, which is the international arm of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. And Ms. Fred worked for 8 years as a human rights officer for the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, and for 10 years with the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. Welcome, Latanya. Thank you for being here with us. And we have Tina Musuya with us today. She's Executive Director of the Center for Domestic Violence Prevention, CEDOVIP, and a member of the Coalition of Feminists for Social Change, COFEM. And Tina has 16 years of experience of working with communities, police, civil society, local government, and policymakers to prevent violence against women. She's also led implementation of the successful pilot of SASA, the program in Kampala, and which is a groundbreaking initiative that reduced physical intimate partner violence by 52%. She coordinated the development of the Uganda Police Force Domestic Violence Handbook and the Police GBV Training Manual. As a member of Uganda Law Reform Commission Task Force, she helped draft and successfully campaigned for passage of the Domestic Violence Act, and she continues to guide on its implementation. Thank you, Tina, for being here with us today. Wonderful to have you. Also as a representative, as I mentioned, of the Coalition of Feminists for Social Change, COFEM. And we are joined by Kamani Yinadasa. She works in the area of preventing gender-based violence. And when working at CARE International Sri Lanka, she spearheaded the largest study on Sri Lanka to understand men's attitudes and knowledge on gender-based violence, which was called Broadening Gender, Why Masculinities Matter, in collaboration with Partners for Prevention. Kamini worked at the International Rescue Committee in New York as the primary prevention specialist, and she now works as a consultant for the World Bank as a senior gender specialist and a gender-based violence specialist for South Asia. Kamini is the executive director and founder of Shanti Margam, which explores innovative and multidisciplinary approaches to working with children to reduce violence in communities. Thank you also, Kamini, for being here with us today. And then we are joined by Umberto Carollo, who is the executive director of White Ribbon Canada, and he's global co-chair of our very own MenEngage Alliance. He's a man and masculinities and gender-based violence prevention expert, and he has 20 years of experience in the not-for-profit sector. He has extensive cross-cultural experience in developing and overseeing large-scale and multinational programs and strategies involving diverse stakeholders in numerous sectors. And currently, Umberto is focusing on developing educational strategies to engage men and boys in promoting gender equality, healthy masculinities, and preventing gender-based violence. And he has developed and implemented training programs for male-dominated sectors, including sports and the military. And he has delivered high-level workplace gender equity and sexual harassment prevention training to the United Nations. And Umberto sits on the External Advisory Council for the Canadian Armed Forces and the Department of National Defense Sexual Misconduct Response Center. Thank you, Umberto, for being with us today. And then we will hear from Alan, and we'll actually pass it on to Alan pretty soon now. He's a gender expert with more than 20 years of experience working on issues of masculinity, violence, and oppression in countries of the Global South and North, and Alan has published widely on these issues. He authors a range of curricula and toolkits for use in professional development. He's an experienced gender trainer and facilitator of strategic planning and project design processes for a range of international and national organizations. And he's a co-founder of the New York-based Challenging Male Supremacy Project, and he is very committed to a vision of social justice with gender equality at its heart. And today he is here with us as the lead author of the paper. And I myself am moderating the conversation today. My name is Joni van der Zand. I am the global co-director of the MenEngage Global Secretariat. And together with Lakshman Balbasa, he's our other co-director, we lead the MenEngage Global Secretariat team. So let me actually, without further ado, then pass it on to you, Alan, to introduce the paper for us, and in particular, Chapter 6, that really looks at the context of our own work as organizations in the human rights, in the women's rights and gender justice sector, and particularly the men and masculinities work and organizations and programming in that field. Thanks, Alan. Over to you.
Thanks, Joni, and hi everyone. Great to see so many of you joining us. So I'm going to walk you through Chapter 6 in the paper and its main points to set up the discussion with our great panel of discussants. So as Joni's explained, it's from this discussion paper that was produced late last year. Next slide, please. And apologies to all of you, or many of you have probably been with us on previous sessions on different chapters, but I'm just going to briefly situate this discussion in relation to the paper itself. So the paper grew out of the strategic planning process that I supported the MenEngage Alliance with last year. I wrote a context analysis for the strategic plan, and it's from that context analysis that this discussion paper comes. Context analysis itself was based on discussions that we had with the Secretariat staff, with the Global Board, and I interviewed a range of key informants. So the thinking in the discussion paper, it's a collective thinking that's come out of that collective process from last year. It's not just coming out of my head, although I've tried to summarize the key points that came out of that collective discussion. And I should also say that what's in the discussion paper is intended to inform and stimulate action. In other words, it's not an academic exercise in surveying all of the issues in relation to the topics that are in the paper, because that would take several volumes and fill a whole library. So we tried to identify particular issues in each of these themes that we need to think about, meaning we, the MenEngage Alliance, need to think about more carefully in this next period of its strategic plan. So it's to inform action. Next slide, please. And as Yoni said, we've had these five overall discussions. The previous ones are focused on political, economic, social, and digital contexts, which, if you like, are the external contexts within which we're working. And the final section of this topic of today's discussion is looking more internally. So how do we think about these external contexts in relation to what's going on within our organizations, within the field of working with men and boys, gender transformative work with men and boys? So it's kind of turning our attention to these internal dynamics and issues that we need to pay attention to. Next slide, please. And just to remind ourselves, this discussion paper itself kind of takes three starting points. It's clear that we need to bring about a gender transformation that we talk about will require radical systems change. And I think, that's always been clear, but it's becoming more obvious by the day. I think that in many of the crises which beset the world are all enmeshed with patriarchal, male supremacist gender relations, and to undo those, we need a radical systems change agenda. To pursue that agenda, we need to be very clear about the obstacles and problems that we're facing. So a lot of the purpose in the discussion paper is to highlight particular obstacles and problems and generate conversations around them, so we can come to a more common understanding of what those obstacles are about and what's needed to address them. And then we face the question of how our work, broadly defined gender transformative work with men and boys on patriarchal masculinities, relates to and can contribute to this broader movements and agendas for radical systems change. Next slide, please. And just to situate that agenda, as I say, this is a quote from a feminist convening in late 2019. We seek a radical transformation of a world in crisis, putting women, people, and the planet over profit. So those are the stakes of the struggles we're in. Next slide, please. And the paper also draws on the work of feminist activists and campaigners, some of whom within the Women's Rights Caucus, which convenes feminist civil society at the UN, they note the problems of the neoliberal economic order as a key structural barrier. They express grave concern at the rise of authoritarianism, fascism, nationalism, xenophobia, supremacist ideologies, and fundamentalisms. And they clearly reject the actions of regressive groups who reinforce those oppressive forces. So I think, the challenge for our work is to understand and situate ourselves in relation to these structural forces and challenges. Next slide, please. So as I say, we turn our attention in this discussion internally, and I broke this section of the paper up into 3 subsections, which looks at the rationale for this work with gender transformative work with men and boys, the importance of staying accountable and what that means, and the need to expand attention to social change. Next slide, please. So I think this question of rationale, for whose sake are we doing this work? Why do any of us start doing this work? That's a question, a question that often comes up in discussions when you sit down with groups of men to talk about patriarchy and male supremacy is, why should men change, when they benefit from patriarchal structures? And this question of for whose sake are we doing the work, I think has been around this work for as long as it's been around, and it's grown significantly. If you think about 1995 Beijing conference, when the work with men and boys was first given a platform, if you like, and the call was made that we need more men and boys to get more involved in work for gender equality. Since then, the field of that work has grown exponentially. But these questions about, so why should men, why are we talking to men about this? For whose sake are we talking with men about this? Has been around. And if you look back at kind of discussions that were held in the 1970s, the early days of men sitting together in groups to talk about patriarchy, these questions about, are we meeting to support women's liberation, or are we meeting to also talk about our own liberation, or how do we think about those 2 things together, was present from the 1970s onwards. So the discussion paper that was produced for the previous MenEngage Symposium in 2014 raised this concern about, well, when we talk to men about doing this work, we need to kind of not stay confined with we're talking to you as men because we want you as men to do this work for the sake of women and girls. And this rationale was characterized as perhaps too instrumentalist. We're working with men so that they can benefit women and girls. And the suggestion was made that we need to be thinking more in terms of men and boys, and it's framed in terms of women and girls on one side, men and boys on the other side. We need to work with men and boys as co-beneficiaries. That was the language used in that previous discussion paper, so that men and boys will benefit from these efforts to address patriarchy and male supremacy. Women and girls will benefit, but also men and boys will benefit in different ways. And we need to think about talking to men and reaching out to men as co-beneficiaries. But at the same time that the paper was making that argument, it also noted that some of this emphasis on kind of the harms of masculinity to men as being an entry point into work with men on patriarchy and male supremacy has resulted in a situation where this work with men and boys on the harms of masculinity has become a little too disconnected from ongoing women's rights work and too unaccountable to that work. So rather than being a part of a broader effort to end gender injustice, that this work with men and boys on the harms of masculinity has become too separate. And the dangers of that have been noted, that that can result in situations where actually patriarchal power is reproduced rather than challenged, both at the level of organizations and at in the different ways in which the conversations with men about what are the issues to be addressed can end up reinforcing a kind of complicity with patriarchal relations of power and focusing exclusively on men and boys as the victims of patriarchal relations of power. And next slide, please. And Kamini will know about this from her time with IRC, but certainly this concern with this focus on the harms of masculinity to men led to the development of IRCs engaging Men in through Accountable Practice program. IRC had done an evaluation of a male involvement project in Liberia, which found that discussions became too male focused and that patriarchal power showed up unchallenged in group meetings. So on the basis of that experience and others, IRC developed this very in-depth program, which I had some connection with in terms of doing a training of trainers around it, which tried to really ground the work with men in an accountable practice in support of women's rights work, needing to hold those two things together. Next slide, please. And COFEM, as Yoni's already mentioned, COFEM wrote a very important series of papers in 2017, and I've got a quote from one of those papers here. COFEM was warning back then of a parallel system emerging of male engagement campaigns, programs, organizations, and networks that, although allied theoretically to feminist principles, stand largely independent of the women's movement. So again, we've had this concern, and it's a continuing concern, that the work with men and boys in some instances has become too separate from and unaccountable to ongoing women's rights work. Next slide, please. So this question of accountability looms large in the paper, and I think it's loomed large in the work of the MenEngage Alliance, I would say, certainly over the last 5 years. And I think what the work is still, grappling with are the implications of an ally framework. What does it mean to say that we are allies? Now, I know, there are different conversations in different places about the value or the political kind of utility of this ally framework. Sometimes it's critiqued for itself being too kind of implicitly paternalistic, but I think it's still a useful framework for us to be in conversation about, and particularly to think in terms of what that means for how our work, which we characterize as gender transformative work with men and boys, takes leadership from those most oppressed by the patriarchal systems which we're challenging. And usually that would mean leadership from women and LGBTQIA plus communities. So this question of not just kind of consulting with those most oppressed by patriarchal systems, but taking leadership from them, I think is an issue that it would be interesting to hear from the discussants about. And, further complicated, I think, by the fact that the MenEngage Alliance itself is composed of many organizations which self-identify as women's rights organizations. So this question about what does it mean to say we're taking leadership from those organizations, how does that show up in the work of the Alliance itself? So the Alliance has certainly invested a great deal of time and effort into developing a set of accountability standards and practices, which many of you will be familiar with. And I think that work grew explicitly out of these critiques that I've been alluding to. And we can talk about, hear from the discussants about their views on how that work is rolling out and how they see that impacting changes in practice at the, organizational level where they are. I think it's also important to think about this issue or issues of accountability and practices of accountability in terms of how we think about being accountable to a feminist systems change agenda and the movements that are pushing that agenda. So there's accountability in terms of when incidents of oppressive behavior are experienced, and how are we held accountable for the oppressive behavior which we've been involved in. But then there's also the kind of movement level issue about how do we understand our accountability to these broader feminist movements for systems change and their agendas. Next slide, please. And when we're thinking through those issues of accountability to systems change agendas, I think we need to, think broadly about the different ways in which those systems change agendas shows up in different issues. So here we have women in landless communities in Bangladesh organizing to demand land rights. In other words, involved in an economic justice struggle, but very much bound up with gender justice struggles. So in the course of that work, Nigera Kori, that supported the women and men in those landless communities to get organized, women often in the leadership, the villages where they worked, they ended child marriage and abolished dowry. So the struggles for land rights and women's involvement in those struggles also led to profound changes in gender inequalities in those villages. We also have women in leadership in struggles against police violence and the patriarchal domination that's embodied in acts of state violence. So that picture is from the anti-SARS protests in Nigeria and the Black Lives Matter movements in the US and elsewhere. Women of color have been in the leadership of those movements. So in many ways, those movements are feminist movements as well as anti-racist struggles. And of course, the Fridays for Future struggles for climate justice. Young women have been in the leadership of those struggles. And again, you can think of those struggles against patriarchal kind of extraction and exploitation as being feminist struggles for climate justice. So how does our work, gender transformative work with men and boys, relate to these movements? That's the question, because there are men in all those movements as well, right? So how do we support men in those movements to be working towards this vision of feminist systems change? Next slide, please. So that finally leads us to thinking about, so how do we expand our attention to social change agenda? I think there is a concern that, long expressed actually within the field of gender transformative work with men and boys, that the work continues to be too focused on kind of attitudinal and behavioral change at the individual level and doesn't pay sufficient attention to what the work that's needed for this broader systems change. Of course, they're not mutually exclusive. Work for systems change often leads to profound changes in attitudes and behaviors at the individual level. But I think there are ways in which, many of the programs that get funded by donors and many of the toolkits, some of which I've been involved in writing, have stayed too narrowly focused on sitting down in a room with a group of men and talking about what they need to change about their attitudes and their behaviors in relation to their personal relationships. That's critical work, but too often I think it hasn't been connected to these broader agendas for change and the different ways in which men can get involved in those broader agendas. And I think one problem that's linked to that is that there's been a kind of lack of emphasis and even kind of lack of skills for bringing in an intersectional analysis and approach to our work. So too often the men and boys agenda treats men and boys as a kind of implicitly homogenized group, which needs to change in order either to end their harms of masculinity or for the sake of women and girls, another homogenized group. Whereas, of course, there are women and girls' experiences of patriarchy and male supremacy as men and boys' experiences of patriarchy and male supremacy are shaped by many other forces of inequality and oppression. And I think understanding those different forces and the different ways in which they affect men and boys' experiences of patriarchy and male supremacy not only connects more concretely with men and boys' lived experience of their lives, whether you're a poor black man in a favela in Brazil or a middle-class white man like me in New York, we have some things in common, we have many things not in common. Understanding those specificities helps us to connect with men and boys in terms of their concrete experiences of life, but also their concrete experiences of these systems, oppressive systems, which we are trying to change. So without that intersectional understanding, I think it's more difficult to mobilize men in support of that systems change agenda. Part of the problem then, I think, linked to that is that this emphasis on kind of harmful norms of masculinity, which I think remains quite widespread across the field. If you read a lot of the accounts of the ways in which problems are being framed, they're often framed in terms of harmful norms of masculinity, but often they're understood in terms of individuals and social psychology, and individuals and their reference group and their understandings of the expectations of others and how those shape particular individual behaviors, rather than norms being grounded in the political economy of power relations and being kind of legitimations of unequal power relations. So I think that kind of social psychological framing of norms has militated against this social change agenda which we're trying to emphasize. And finally, I think as we call for a repoliticization of our work, and I say repoliticization because I think if you look at how this work has begun with men and boys in many places, in the UK, in the US, in Nicaragua, in South Africa, in India, it often began in the context of other political struggles, whether it be liberation struggles, anti-apartheid struggles. Many of the men's groups in the UK that started to talk about patriarchy were socialist feminist men's groups. So there was a systems change politics around in the early days of work with men and boys that I think over the years has become diminished or neglected. So to reconnect with that, to repoliticize our work, we also need to reconnect with our analyses of power and oppression. And to do that, the paper argues we need to decolonize our work. And it would be great to hear from the discussants about what that means in practice. It's a word that's getting thrown around a lot now. We brought it into the conversation in the strategic planning period last year, and I think it's still a relatively new conversation for the MenEngage Alliance, certainly at the kind of secretariat and board level. But it's really thinking about the colonial histories, whether as colonizers or colonized, out of which we come, which have shaped so profoundly gender relations through to the present day, whether it's thinking about the neo-colonial aid structures of which the MenEngage Alliance is a part, and many of our work is a part of an international structure of aid, which in many ways remains neo-colonial in its structuring of global North-South relations, and also thinking about how we organize the MenEngage Alliance itself. MenEngage Alliance has an interesting trans North-South structure with its regional networks. So it's not like international development NGOs, which are headquartered in the North and work in the South. It's not like that, but it still has its headquarters in Washington, DC. It's trying to become a more genuinely multilingual structure, but I think a lot of it still is quite Anglo-centric. That was some of the feedback that I was getting when I was talking to key informants last year for the strategic planning process. And I think certainly this is not just to do with the Alliance, but certainly if you look at knowledge production, and particularly kind of practice-based knowledge, a lot of it still remains produced by people who look and sound like me, rather than men of color from different parts of the world, or indeed women of color in the global South. So we're thinking about how we produce knowledge that shapes what we do. Also, we need to think about decolonizing knowledge production. And the paper says a bit more about that. Next slide, please. I'm nearly done. So on this issue of decolonization, this is a quote from the Gender Development Network Women of Color Forum from 2020. Time after time, the international aid sector has failed to make the space for rigorous discussions about systemic racism and white supremacy. and the ways in which they work to uphold structures and authorities that perpetuate the racism and paternalism of international aid and development. So really, you know, reckoning with those structures and how do we operate both inside them and against them. Next slide, please. So what does all this mean? The paper lays out some shared commitments that we need to ground ourselves in, and it kind of highlights these issues of decolonization and anti-racist work. I think are the kind of more recent additions to the MenEngage Alliance kind of code of conduct and principles, which it's already outlined. It's also getting clear about really how change happens. I think taking seriously the famous statement by Frederick Douglass, famous anti-slavery campaigner in the 19th century US and formerly enslaved person himself, power concedes nothing without a demand. So that systems change agenda will only happen when people get organized to demand change. And we need to think about how our work contributes to that organizing and demand making. And the paper lays out kind of quite simply, we need to think through these issues of what, who, and how. So when we talk about patriarchal masculinities, we're not just talking about them being expressed at the individual level, but how are they expressed institutionally and ideologically, and thinking about institutional change and processes of ideological change as being part of our work. And I think if you think back to the previous conversations about other contexts, certainly those issues of different institutions and the ways in which we can try and push for ideological change have been discussed. The who, we need to really get past this men and boys homogenized framework and really bring a strongly intersectional understanding of different men's different experiences and relationships and expressions of patriarchy. Diverse men have diverse roles in change. I think too often this kind of homogenized view of men and boys, it has tended to mean working with poorer men in the community, but hasn't named it as such. So there's tended to be an insufficient attention to how do we hold powerful men in institutional positions of authority to account. So to what extent is our work about holding men in power to account? And then also, how do we help men in different kinds of communities find common cause with women in those communities? So the men in landless communities in Bangladesh, they have much more in common with women in their communities than they do with the male landowning elite. How do we help break down how do we help forge those cross-gender alliances at community level that can be a part of struggles for social justice? And then thinking about the how, the strategy that MenEngage ended up with has really thought about how in three big ways, in terms of continuing to support the quality of program work by its members, strengthening its advocacy work at different levels, and really thinking about how it contributes to movement building. Final slide, please. And on this movement building, this is a quote from the paper. We recognize both the political responsibility and practical necessity of orienting our work from local to the global level toward contributing to feminist and LGBTQIA+ movement building. The agenda for radical systems change that underpins the visions for gender justice discussed in this discussion paper call for social movement organizing. So that's the challenge for us. How do we figure our contributions to those movements, and what skills and relationships and orientations do we need to strengthen in order to improve those contributions? I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for giving a clear overview of what's in chapter 6 of the paper. So I would like to now hand it over then to Latanya and Kamini. Thank you again for being here with us. And just opening up the floor to you really to share your perspectives on what you've heard Alan present so far. And we can just start with whatever it is that you want to share, and then we'll invite, after hearing from you, we'll invite Tina and Umberto in as well. So Latanya, first over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Joni. Wow, Alan, that was incredible. Even after reading the paper, I thought that was a real um, good overview of where I think we are. I am thankful to MenEngage in this symposium for inviting me. And as most of you know, at Global Fund for Women, we fund women's human rights groups. And so this issue of how men and boys can be allies has come up so often. And I think we continue to think through how we can support each other in this work. It does remind me, as Alan was talking earlier days when I was at the United Nations, in this discussion around women and girls, whether we should mainstream it. And so, the thinking was, I think there was a thought process that everything we do, whether it's program advocacy or policy work, should include a women's component. And that was the way to ensure that we would get to some of this structural social change that we're looking and seeking. But unfortunately, that didn't always work. And so the practice of mainstreaming, was difficult in so many ways. And so what often would happen is that because of the difficulty in trying to engage at various levels, some kind of women's component, it often meant that the women's issues and women's progress was set back. It almost regressed in the mainstreaming. And then we thought, okay, well, then we need a specific women's program, right? And it's kind of what we're talking about now with specific men and boys programs. And we thought, well, if we had specific women's programs, then that would address everything. And I think, skip ahead, a couple of decades, what we found is that you needed both. You needed to be able to do both. And so this is kind of what I'm hearing now in the MenEngage. So yes, we need to have men and boys as allies in the movements, the social movements that we're addressing for structural change and gender justice, but we also need them to have their own programs. And so it's not a, or, it's an and. And then how do we support each other along that journey? Alan talked about sort of these intersectional inequalities that we're experiencing, not just in the women human rights sector, but also in the men and boys sector. And so he kind of talked through sort of how men are not just one kind. And then we start talking gender identity. You find that, you might not be able to categorize men and boys and women and girls in the same way. And so how do we think about that and come up with structures that allow all of us to be part of a collective social justice effort, and in particular work on gender justice issues together if we take away this sort of gender binary approach that we've been using? And so it's very and for me and the work that I've been doing over the years, it's very important that we continue to shift and change our programming as we try to tackle some of these really profound issues, if we're going to get to the goal, which is the systems change, to dismantle the patriarchy, the authoritism, the fascism, the nationalism, the xenophobia. These things are going to require us to work as a collective. Global Fund for Women is committed to movement building. And so gender justice movements around the world that have been really the backbone and underpinning of most of the sustainable change that we've seen, certainly since colonialism, but probably even before that. And so I guess I'll just end by saying that timing is perfect, this symposium, to think through how we look at our programs for men and girls together within a movement framework, a social movement framework. And we could talk more about that as we go, but I want to give Kamani a chance to give her impressions as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Latanya. Yes, I totally agree with you. Thank you so much, Alan. I think that was a great paper, and you really highlighted some important questions that have been coming up over the past few decades on the work around engaging men and boys. And I think in my context, I'm coming from a place of a person who has been involved in this work and who has been really interested in seeing how you actually bring it out into the communities And yes, so from my own practical experience. So I actually wanted to address some of the questions, and I think, Yoni, you may need to jump in and tell me when to stop, because for me, the key question around, okay, how is the work framed? Is it about just, is it about men being involved for the sake of addressing the most, the gender injustices, or being concerned with what harms men and boys who suffer from patriarchal masculinities? And for me, it's kind of been almost like a personal inquiry for me over the years. I mean, men are the main perpetrators of violence against women and girls. And so for me, it's been a huge question. How is it that, how is this happening? Why is this happening? And some people who are on this call also know this history of mine. And something I've been seeing, which kind of also disturbs me in a way, is that there's almost like we're putting the onus of reducing violence against women and girls upon women and girls. In a way, we're saying, we're having these programs to end violence against women, and we're focusing on your women and girls. And for me, I feel the most we can do is by helping girls and women speak out about their experiences and ensure that there are systems and processes which they can turn to that are well equipped to address their issues. But we can't do this work without really, in my experience and in my view, without really acknowledging how men are creating or perpetuating this violence. And I was on a panel discussion with Kamla Basin recently. She's a famous feminist from our side of the world. And she said, let's call it what it is. It isn't violence against women and girls, it's violence by men. And the fact that, for me, what I see is that, GBV is part of a continuum of violence. It's part of a larger way that society has allowed violence to occur and people to perpetrate it without very little, facing little repercussions. And some studies have shown that, say, with the mass shootings in the USA, that most of those men were perpetrators of domestic violence. And in my work, especially a study that I was very much involved in, James Lang, who led this, is part of this call and who has been a great friend of mine throughout my journey, the Partners for Prevention UN multi-country study on men and violence, which brought out findings from a sample of 10,000 men from 6 countries. Really brought out what, men's perspective, analyzing their views and attitudes towards gender inequalities and gender-based violence. And key risk factors for intimate partner violence were masculine norms, harmful masculine norms, negative childhood experiences, depression, alcoholism. Key motivations for rape came up as sexual entitlement, which was like 61% across all countries that participated in this study. And for me, that was such a huge aha moment, because things like alcoholism and anger were very much in the smaller categories of, say, 4%. Whereas across all countries, we saw this huge jump of men having a sense of sexual entitlement. And that itself, it shows how we really need to work with men. But also other statistics that really shocked me were among boys and men who had perpetrated rape, young people who were within the ages of 15 to 19 made up 30% of this sample that had perpetrated their first rape. And, I think these are questions, these statistics, this information, it's something we really need to look at and explore why. And as Alan speaks in his paper, different groups have different factors affecting them and impacting them to behave in particular ways. But I think one thing that really stood out for me from this Partners for Prevention study was the aspect that, to really simplify it, hurt people hurt people. And I feel, for me, it's been really important to address this element also in my spiritual journey as well, because for me, I really do find it difficult to look at gender-based violence within a vacuum. Of course, there are so many aspects of how, because of patriarchy, how women are looked at and how it upholds women being suppressed and subjugated and not being afforded, proper opportunities to speak out, etc. But also the political aspects of, for example, if you look within our side of the world, South Asia, I mean, we're a part of the world that's been fraught with violence, colonialism. Sri Lanka just ended, well, not just ended, we had a civil war. And at the end of it, you saw the emergence of, a nationalistic sense of what it is to be a man, a Sinhala Buddhist man, and what was expected of women to be this impossible, virtuous woman who behaves and dresses in a particular way. And then on the flip side, you saw in the north where most of the people who were affected by the war lived, where they had to deal with a lot of, loss, trauma, and there were issues of economic issues, and the men started perpetrating a lot more domestic violence. And you see this also in COVID, you see the emergence and high rates of domestic violence, including violence against children. And I think to me, it shows how we really need to address these aspects. We can't do one without looking at the other aspects. And I mean, for me, as I said, this has been kind of a personal inquiry, and I set up an organization called Shanti Margam. James Allen all have supported me in this work. And we've adopted a combination of addressing root causes of gender-based violence, gender inequalities, and also a more holistic development of addressing using the tool of or framework of positive youth development, which helps children develop more behavioral or moral competencies, empathy, self-esteem, and addressing mental health. And we have seen a lot of changes among girls standing up and saying, I don't like this kind of behavior. I do not want to be spoken to in this way. And the boys also changing how they respond and how they carry out their roles. So I'm going to stop there before I go into more areas, but because I want to leave space for Latanya also to speak. Thank you.
Thank you both. Let me just pick up on two things that both of you shared and then pass it back to Latanya again. So first on the kind of the framing of engaging men in this work, we're really questioning how to handle the matter of men's needs and vulnerabilities, and are men co-beneficiaries in all of this. I think, Kamini, thank you for the reminder that if we want to break the cycle of men's violence, we have to look at where that comes from. And you're saying hurt people. And I think, in the discussion paper, in the previous session, we talked about digital context. There is men who are hurt want to go somewhere. And there is a huge appeal of online messages that are misogynist, that are anti-feminist. We've been talking about the manosphere last week. So what can we as MenEngage Alliance do to prevent men from going into that direction, and instead appeal to men and to their experiences to actually join the work on women's rights and gender justice? And I think it's a question that we're facing, and I would love to hear your perspectives. So it comes from a recognition that men are affected by patriarchy, but how do we address that, call them in, be part of the change without kind of reaffirming the emphasis on men's needs and men's perspectives, and kind of reinforcing patriarchy by focusing on men? So that's one. The other one then, Latanya, you said, so we need both standalone and mainstream work, just as we did and do with women and for women's rights. We need to do the same with men. And you mentioned programming with men specifically. So I wonder then, if we broaden that to kind of the field of work and the scope of work, CoFem has raised, it's concerning that some of the field of work or the body of work on men and masculinities has become so standalone. It's not connected to the work on women's rights. But I wonder then, is there a space for not only the programming of work, but separate kind of organizations or even an alliance such as MenEngage Alliance really focusing on this work? Or should we integrate and not have a separate alliance as such? Should we not call ourselves MenEngage? All of these kind of questions around where does the standalone work actually sit for MenEngage itself. So I'd love to hear from you, Latanya, and any other things that you may want to share at this point.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I so appreciate Kamani really going in around gender-based violence, because I think it does, help us think about how we program and the integration of programs. And, just a little story. When I first started, I was with UNICEF, and I was based, my first post with them was in Lesotho in Southern Africa. And my job was as a child protection officer, was how we define human rights officers at that point at UNICEF. And the job was to look at the context, the environment, as we've mentioned, Alan and Kamani has mentioned, every place has a different context. And so my job was to figure out what were the gender issues in the country. And so I did a fairly exhaustive analysis and found that the actual most gendered issue that was facing Lesotho children at the time was herd boys. And so really kind of flipped the whole the thought, as most folks assumed, that analysis would come out with some issues for women and girls that needed to be tackled programmatically. But what we found, the gender issue around herd boys was the thing that was most difficult in the society, and the impact that was having on this generations of boys over time. And I love the concept of, hurt people hurt other people, and what was happening to those boys when they were sent out for sometimes as long as 2 to 5 years to just herd without going to school, without protections either from the environment or others who would prey on them. And so I bring that up because I think that we can't assume that every sort of issue around gender just means a standalone women and girls program. I think we do have to consider the possibility that in some contexts, a standalone men and boys program is required. And not only is it required, but it needs the combination of women's rights groups and men and boys groups to be able to tackle the issue and get to some of the cultural and social, and not to mention economic and political issues that it profoundly brings up. And so in that case, we created programs to address some of the needs, and it's a long-term cultural issue, so you have to work on it long-term, and you have to work on it as a collective. And that was some of the challenges we found, is that so many programs, the concept was you find a group who can, an organization that can work on that issue, and we should be fine. But now we're smarter, decades later, we know that we have to work in a movement capacity. I teach a course at Columbia University at Melman School of Public Health, where we actually dig into the DNA of social movements for health outcomes. And this is one of the things that we found, is that it's not just a one-off track, that sort of these collective social movements are the avenue to get to some of the social changes I mentioned before. And in this case, for sure, if we're working on feminist agendas, then we absolutely want to include men and boys as allies. Seeing them both from the perspective of the perpetration of patriarchy, but also as the recipient of a pathway to gender justice. And when we think about, I grew up, and I suspect many of the women on this call grew up with fathers who absolutely were feminists, whether they called themselves that or not, because they believed in the equality of women and girls, and they treated you and your brothers, the same. And they treated you in a way that prepared you to enter the world as an equal. And so I know that there is so much to think about when we're programming, but I do hope that the dynamics of how we show up together is super, super important if we're trying to achieve at the end a sustainable social, political, and economic change. So I'll end there and hope that answered some of what you were thinking, and love to hear what Kamani thinks as well.
Thanks so much, Latanya. I really do appreciate your perspectives, and I think by what you're saying, I mean, it's so obvious that it's so personal to us, right? When we do this work, and I think we cannot move away from the individual transformation perspective, which I would like to touch on later on. But I think also there's a lot more emerging evidence around how children's experiences, witnessing violence, their own experience of violence, come up in adulthood, and also how, you know, the cycle continues, intergenerational transmission of violence, we call it. And fortunately, interestingly, there's a lot more information coming out now, which should guide us in this work and make us understand why it is also so important to work with the next generation. Because I feel, you know, we've certainly been doing something totally wrong. There's so much violence, so, you know, lack of respect for the environment and people, I mean, as a general. And I would really love to see us investing more in the next generation of this world. But I'd also like to touch a bit on, okay, what do you really need for this change? And as Alan said, I was leading the work on EMAP when I was living in New York, and it was very interesting. I loved the framework because it really integrated a way to bring in women's voices into the work. I remember Michael Flood wrote a paper in 2015, I think. Alan, I remember you referring to it many years ago, and he said, you know, this is one of the most promising programs out there. And but one of the key aspects that was essential for that program was to have a very good facilitator, a person who was really trained to be able to lead conversations around with the men's groups, and how do you really effectively bring in women's voices and show and hold them accountable to the women's reactions to their behaviors. And I think something Alan and I saw when we did a training for some global for the global community of men who have worked on this work for years. Even they, you know, they realized that they still held harmful attitudes and behaviors towards women, despite so many years of work. And so that really also, to me, draws my attention to the need of really investing in good resources for this work. And I think that's also where the dynamics and the politics of funding comes in, because you need, and also the aspect of North versus South in the sense of programming, because, you know, in my work at IRC and even in Sri Lanka, in the region, there's such rich knowledge of people in the field, and how do we bring those voices up? And, you know, language is such a huge barrier. I used to be actually quite frustrated to see that. And I don't have a real answer, but I used to really push for, you know, really trying to create spaces for people from the field level to come up. And I know organizations do try, and maybe there are people on this call who might be able to give us some good examples on how that can be done better. But something I really also appreciated, and I think Yoni, you touched on it, was about allies, or the three roles. Alan defined the co-beneficiary aspect of men being involved in this work. Or is it, or do we engage men as allies? And I think, in a way, if we're looking at a man to work as an ally, we're admitting and recognizing his power in this system. We have all been allies. I have been an ally to my colleagues in the field of HIV and AIDS, but I have used my power to create spaces for my colleagues. And so what does allyship look like? And then are you going to look for men to be stakeholders? And it's important to start defining and understanding the pluses and minuses that come with it, instead of having very high expectations that men are expected to behave in a particular way and not in a particular way. But also, yes, the aspect of a co-beneficiary, as you would understand from what I have been sharing, is what really resonates better with me in this work. And I think, how does MenEngage do this, or do this work and be accountable to women's voices? I think it's part of a longer conversation, and I'm sure we'll have more time. But for me, it really starts from the individual. Otherwise, what happens is you see the aspect of men's power being reproduced, and I've seen this in South Asia. I remember questioning a friend of mine. I felt there was a man who was in this group that I was in, really using his power and kind of oppressing in a way. Like I didn't feel comfortable. And I asked this person, how is it that he's behaving in this way? And she said, well, Kamini, if he's at least supporting this work and empowering women, I'm okay with it. And it confused me. I was new to the work, but later on I've been reading up on this work, and Alan articulates it really well about putting men on the pedestal, and men who haven't done the work to question their power and how they reproduce it when they implement work. So yeah, I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. I want to now also invite Tina and Umberto in. And then we'll bring you all together again after hearing from them now. So Tina and Umberto, just an open question to you as well. What you've heard Latanya and Kamini share, what you've heard Ellen present, what you've read in the paper. What are like some of the key things that you would like to share with us at this point? And Tina, may I invite you in first?
Okay, thank you so much. This is really a very exciting panel, and I'd just like to build on what my colleagues have said. And Alan, thank you very much for giving that broad and very insightful overview. For me, coming from COFEM and also from CEDOVIC, I really feel that the whole conversation around accountability is very timely, because then we need to be going deep to question ourselves. That's about MenEngage looking inside to really see what is accountability. How can we stay accountable to the feminists and all the other social justice movements? And even going to the uncomfortable points around what is it that hasn't happened well, and having those difficult reflections about what do we need to do now. And I was particularly impressed that I know we in COFEM saw these things and penned them down, and we've been sharing with you and everyone else, and also MenEngage networks in our regions, and many times they've come off as really annoying and almost offending our seeming allies. But it's very important that we have to get to those deeper conversations, because we were seeing this work of MenEngage much as they're supposed to be allies, co-beneficiaries. They were running parallel pieces of work that were being disconnected from the agenda of gender equality. And they would keep a blind eye on things that truly matter and are seemingly controversial and priority issues of women. For example, here in Uganda, we've had quite a number of difficult situations whereby, if, for example, we are coming up with laws that are addressing issues around the power dynamics, especially between men and women, issues to do with sexual violence and so on, issues of property rights, much as our groups in MenEngage Alliance are present, they will become super deaf and blind to the struggles that we are going through. There was a case in point that really, me as a feminist, I was really angry with the MenEngage movement. We had a member of parliament who had been sexually harassed online, and she took her case to court. Now, something horrible happened here in Uganda. Many men groups organized to go and provide support for the guy who had sexually harassed this member of parliament. And they set up resistance. There was a lot of social media campaign. Pastors were leading that backlash and, silencing the voices of women and saying, oh, this man had rights to really make a move on the beautiful MP. So men should not be punished for making their proposals clear. And now that was something we in the feminist groups were standing with this member of parliament, and we never had any support from the MenEngage. And then it comes to how is accountability being practiced within all this social justice movement. So when we have this deep conversation, for me, I think it's a good starting point. And of course, pointing to how is MenEngage movement moving from rhetoric to practice? Because they will say all these nice things as their standards say, but then when it comes to practice, the knees get weak and they do not stand on the seemingly controversial issues. And then, of course, Alan, I think your analysis around the need to move from the individual engagements to transforming social, the systems of oppressions, creating social change. In my perspective, that's extremely needed, and we need to be working towards systems transformation. Yes, the individuals are extremely important, but we need to move beyond that. And in doing this work, we need to be looking again deeper to see what could be the points that might be reinforcing the very oppressions and inequalities that we could be transforming. So for me, when you dig deeper there and the need for intersectionality, when we are analyzing the problem and also programming is, in my view, a very important way to go. Now, when it comes to what I feel was maybe missing, I hope I just didn't miss it, but I thought when it comes to the issue of co-beneficiary, yes, I hear you. Again, we need to interrogate that further so that it's not again misunderstood to again cause victimhood competition and also again swaying away from centering the work on women and going into, oh, how about men? How about men's rights? The way it usually happens here in Uganda. And in Uganda, I don't know whether it's the same in other parts of the world, there's a divide. There's the group of the secretariat. They seem to be more aligned to the standards, but then they have like this huge network of the MenEngage. I think they are scaling up went wild. Sorry for using that word. I say wild because they just kept expanding with no grounding on social justice issues. And I think that's the side in which the parallel activities started and then shifting from the gender equality agenda to now more individualistic kind of needs and reinforcing the male privilege. I think the whole issue of the male privilege needs to be interrogated in its perspective, especially here in Uganda, where it's reinforced by the colonial past, the religious, oh my God, the religious kind of doctrines, and then also our own value systems that kind of concretize that male privilege. We need to be interrogating it further so that, again, it does not reproduce itself in this social justice movement. In Uganda here, the issue of male privilege is like super supreme to the extent that if you're in a space and you're talking about issues of rights, you're talking about issues of social justice and so on, and one man just spoke, they're going to get a huge applause and everyone will be too grateful for what they've said. And whatever is on table is going to be swayed because a man has spoken something right, but they are not interrogating to see what happens away from here. Is it in practice or someone just knows the right words to say? So somehow it causes a lot of suspicion. I'm being honest with you, suspicion between us, the feminists, and some of those champions, because we don't know, are they being honest? Are they being genuine? We need to also interrogate that. How can we how can we get them to earn our trust? And how can we trust them? How can they trust us? So that we understand that if we are allies, and what is allyship? Like, for example, Kamani was asking, do we have a shared understanding of allyship. And if we are allies, how does that work out in practice? And how about the whole issue of where does the change begin from? I would like to agree with Kamani. We need to be looking towards, the change needs to begin with the practitioners themselves. Everyone needs to go through a whole process of transformation, because remember, everyone grew up in these same systems. So we come to work with our life histories, and therefore the process of change needs to begin with us before we take it out. And we need to have a shared understanding of what this change looks like and how is it going to benefit everyone on board, to avoid, again, recreating hierarchies of beneficiaries, who, and so on and so forth. And we need to ground all this in feminist perspectives and principles. And I know I can go on, but for me, I think the whole issue of grounding this work on feminist principles and taking it forward in a feminist way is a really practical way to go. Over to you, Umberto.
Thank you so much, Tina, for those amazing words, and thank you, MenEngage Alliance, and Alan and colleagues for coming together to have this conversation. I'm really happy to be part of it, and I'm hearing so much common ground already, and it's wonderful, because I'm certainly aligned with so much of what has been said already. And Tina, I want to first start by saying I'm so sorry that you experienced that in Uganda, that kind of backlash and resistance from men who are supposed to be, I'm understanding, part of the MenEngage Alliance. And I would say that is not the MenEngage way. That is not part of our principles. We call on men to speak out against oppression and against misogyny. We call on men to believe survivors and support survivors. So what you described seems to be very contrary to our principles. And if that is indeed happening under the umbrella of MenEngage, then we need to think further about that and work together with you to clarify to clarify that. One of the dangers of this work is of course the infiltration of men's rights and the backlash and the resistance movements, and we have to keep that in mind as well as both a challenge and also an opportunity, because I think that is one of the unintended consequences when we don't provide or when we don't create spaces for men to deal with their own past harms and hurts and vulnerabilities and so forth, is that men often look for other sources of support when those are not provided. And this speaks in my mind to the siloed nature of our work, and the need for us to work across these different fields and approaches, and also work across social movements as well. As our colleagues previously have said, men and boys are not homogeneous. They come from different perspectives and lived experiences, and we must find various and diverse entry points along the way to engage with men and make sure that no one is left behind, because this is what can happen. These side movements of resistance and backlash are created. I want to say as well that I believe it's important for us to engage men at different levels, and even when it comes to addressing systems change and working at the highest institutional levels, we must engage with men individually there too, and help them understand that that kind of change is good for our societies, is good for our economy. It's certainly good for women and girls who are disproportionately impacted by that systemic discrimination and oppression, but it's also good for them as leaders too. So we have to bring them on board and help them understand that it is part of their leadership journey to advocate for systemic change and to change patriarchy around. So just as it is important for us to talk to boys and young men on the front lines and help them understand the role that they can play in changing around, yes, their behaviors and their attitudes so that they're engaging in much more equitable ways towards women and girls and towards LGBTQ communities and racialized communities and indigenous communities. Yes, I think that's important. And then also help them understand the journey that they can engage on further once they understand how to change their behaviors and attitudes. How do they then move on to becoming allies, to becoming advocates, to then start advocating and working collectively towards systemic change as well. So we must think of, I think it's important for us to think of engaging men and boys as in an ecological kind of way, right? Looking at the individual, the collective, the community, the institutional and systemic, and find ways to engage men and help men progress along that journey, right? So that they can become agents of change at the systemic level, right? And do that in partnership with women's movements and diverse social justice movements. They can't, overtake that work. I think the accountability principles are important there too. It has to be side by side together with, sometimes, often standing behind and supporting the leadership of women and girls and groups are most disproportionately impacted by this. So we have to also think about this as a life cycle approach and an intergenerational approach. We need to help create leaders, future leaders who are gender equitable, who will contribute to that systemic change and institutional change. We have to consider that. And we also have to use a life cycle approach, look at socialization of boys and young men, yes, but then how that impacts their adult life and the various roles that they play. And we need to address their vulnerabilities and their past harms along the way as well, always in accountable ways. We must not forget the end goal of this work, which is to promote gender equality. It's to redress those historical forms of oppression that women and girls, in particular LGBTQ communities, racialized communities, indigenous communities have experienced over time. And the last quick bit that I would like to mention at this point is the role of funders and the fact that we often, as organizations doing this work, excuse me, we are forced into that siloed nature of the work, which is small scale, time limited. And this kind of transformation requires long-term, large-scale commitments, and it requires organizations of different types and natures to come together and work together. And funders often put us into these positions of having to compete for and work in isolation rather than working together, collaborating and sharing resources.
Thank you so much, Tina and Umberto. I want to pick up on a couple of things that you shared, Tina, and really appreciate your openness. And of course, we have been having ongoing conversations with COFIM and MenEngage Uganda. You referenced a lot that allyship is about really showing up when it matters. And that it's at those moments when the feminist movement steps up for something, it's where the opportunity and the responsibility for MenEngage Alliance lies to step up, to join, to support what it is that is being done. And I think sometimes allyship is as simple in a way as that. And as important as that is, then if at those critical moments we are silent or we are not there, we are in a way complicit and contributing to the problems. I also want to thank you for your reminder that scale up comes with a lot of risks. I think especially as the interest in engaging men and boys work has increased so much, one of the main things we're trying to do as MenEngage Alliance is to caution against the concept of scale up. And definitely whenever programming is done, it can never be a copy paste of something that works in one context and then just do it in the other the same way. It has to be done locally, it has to be contextualized, it has to be implemented by local actors, and always with the feminist movement and women's rights groups in those contexts. I think interestingly, you also mentioned scale up of MenEngage's membership and how that is very risky if it doesn't come with rootedness on what actually being a MenEngage member based on feminist principles means. And you mentioned the risk of reinforcing male privilege. Thank you for that. Thank you, and Umberto, thank you for being part of MenEngage Alliance's work through co-chairing the alliance and bringing all those perspectives in. You also mentioned the socio-ecological model and how this is not a question of do we move from individual change to systems change. And I think for me the key takeaway so far has been and back again and in a constant loop, right? Those have to be connected. And I think for quite some time in MenEngage Alliance, we were talking about the socio-ecological model, as in MenEngage brings individual work together with more policy advocacy work or systems transformation work. And because our members do that, we work across the socio-ecological model. But actually, this series has really made me realize that doing real work has to mean connecting between those different levels and looping back constantly. And I think that is something that we really haven't done so well yet, and is a key takeaway for going forward. I want to bring Latanya and Kamini back into the conversation as well. And I would love to hear from you. It's a bit of a broader question, but just bringing together this concept of allyship and the concept of accountability, right? Because in order to be good allies, we have to be accountable. We have to show that in practice. It really feels to me, from what you've been sharing, those two cannot go without each other. Can you share some of your perspectives, really, like in practice going forward? What does good accountability and good allyship look like for those working on gender transformative approaches with men and boys to dismantle patriarchal masculinities? And I'm just going to, I guess, start back again with you, Latanya.
Thank you so much, and Umberto and Tina, thank you so much for your words. This is such an interesting topic for me. As at the Global Fund for Women, we don't often have these conversations, and we probably should do it more. And also as a funder in this space, why I'm taking a note on accountability myself to go back and look at programs that have engaged men and boys and how that looks within the context of our overall portfolio. But I do want to emphasize with Joni what you're saying around allyship and accountability and how they come together. And I'll go one step further and say when they don't come together, I think we find ourselves in a regressive state, that we could almost set back some of the work around gender justice and social change that's been happening if we don't have them come together. And so I can't overemphasize how important it is to have allyship and accountability connected. We're in this situation in the US, as many of you know, particularly around racial equity, but also gender equity, where there's a lot of lip service. There's a lot of this, I am an ally kind of conversation, and that's it, and there's nothing past that. We have been, I think, all of us, so tired of the constant sort of, web or social statements without anything behind that. And so I certainly feel that in this context, we have to be very careful on how we move so that our words become our actions and our actions become our goals. I know that part of that is, I'll just name one example of how I think about this, is in the influencer game. All of us are sort of steeped in so much of the social media, and we see so much. And, I wasn't privy to your digital conversation, but I suspect it came up on how women are, increasingly targeted at all levels, at all spectrum of society online, and how that has turned into not just abuse by individuals, but actually abuse and in other forms of control by the state using social media. I think it's super important that as we look at men and boys movements, and in particular MenEngage, to be able to call that out is going to be huge. To name it, while it's happening and to call it out no matter who it is, whether it's a head of state or whether it's coming from a shy sort of coded, language that's happening, because it is when we talk accountability, we're talking about that, the naming, and you can't let these acts continue. And of course, in some ways, people think, oh, well, it's just some digital idiots, playing around because they're cloaked and you can't really see them. But that is very much, I think, where this allyship is going to be important. And it's how you're going to be held accountable. Did you stand up? Did you name this injustice? Did you point it out? And did you then, come up with ways to ensure that this doesn't happen? And so right now, I feel like we're in this moment where, back to what I was saying at the beginning, where we can't just say we're an ally, we have to show we're an ally. And I look forward to working together on these issues as we think about how men and boys show up as allies in the feminist movements.
So I think I'm next, and thank you so much, Latanya, for sharing your views. And I agree with you, and even Umberto and Tina, your views were so interesting and illuminating. I mean, for me, where does it start? It really, once again, and we've heard this from all of us, from ourselves, and that whole process of, many years ago, where I met Lakshman was at Sanam training, where we underwent this small exercise about how we use and abuse our own power. And that exercise has stayed with me forever. I'm constantly questioning myself. Have I used power? Have I hurt someone? Have I, used abuse in thought, word, or action? And and for me, I feel that as an ally also, how do you keep bringing that forward into a space where you're trying to support and to meet a certain aim, and in this case we're looking at gender justice. In the absence of that, unfortunately, there is the need to set ground rules and as Latanya said, really speak out and ask the hard questions. Tina shared a really disturbing example of how that went so terribly wrong. And, the whole problem, I mean, if we look at the accountability discussion in MenEngage, it's really started around, people who are in very powerful positions were making decisions where people were not consulted and people felt that they were using their power and moving away from the common goal of MIA. And the thing is, how do you, it's also, what is it? It's also how do you live your values as MIA? And I think once again, it then goes back to the individual organizations, because MIA is a collective of individual organizations. And once again, there was something that Tina said that really struck me. She said, this quick expansion of MIA, how do we bring in members into MIA? Maybe there needs to be some process of screening, and how have you stood up for certain things? I don't know, the criteria would need to be explored, but I think it's something definite to be explored, because also people want to join MIA because it enhances their positioning and visibility for donors and being out there. So maybe that could be a way on how you bring in accountability. But I mean, if you look at the Me Too movement, that has really created space for calling out people, sexual predators. I mean, they had to actually rely on legislation. And I think until people come to the place of really being accountable and questioning themselves, and then feeling comfortable to question each other, you need to have a good set of rules and regulations, and they need to have a process of implementation and punitive action. Maybe that's the lawyer in me coming out, but this is something that I feel very strongly. And yeah, that's what I wanted to share for the question that Yoni asked. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamini, and Latanya as well. And may I pass it on to Tina?
I also would like to build on what my colleagues have said. When it comes to allyship, I don't differ on what they said, and I would just like to re-emphasize the need for whoever is in a privileged position to recognize that power and be more supportive of the ones who have experienced that oppression, so they can support them to take lead and also try to understand the oppression from their perspective. Not to seem like they're champions who know what is already going on, because you are not in that person's shoes. So you have not directly experienced that form of oppression. But you can stand with them in solidarity whenever there is need, and then also help amplify their voices. So for me, allyship is not just about a one-off thing. It is like progressive allyship. And it's also about when you're in a privileged position, I will say this based on how many times when we are representing women from the rural areas who are poor, we tend to assume and speak for them without really listening to them and understanding their perspectives. Now, as allies, we need to be conscious of that and run even our ideas with them to really see if it's reflective and if they're in agreement with us. So for us from COFEM and for me, I think allyship is about us standing together. And even sometimes when we disagree on a certain something, we may agree to stand in solidarity and, say nothing, as opposed to saying many wrong things that are going to, veer the attention of the issues. So for me, that's what the little something that I wanted to add on allyship. And when it comes to accountability, now this one is a big one because everyone talks about accountability. But now when it comes to complex issues around social justice and then violence against women, I think a lot needs to be said broadly, and then the specifics will, of course, will come later. For me, from a COFEM's perspective, accountability is about promoting and supporting women and girls' leadership and decision-making within this programming, even within the offices that they work in. If it's within the MenEngage movement, how is that factoring in? Is it just bringing women who are not grounded on feminist principles to just be there as females, or they are representing women? I think that's a key question that needs to be responded to. Is it just a biological female, or they are here representing issues broadly that women face as injustices and oppressions, and they can raise their voice? So promoting their leadership is extremely important. And then also listening to and learning from and acting on the voices and experiences of diverse groups of women. This work, especially around preventing gender-based violence, it's women who have been leading this process. Yes, I'm not negating what the MenEngage movement have done, but you need to listen to the women and work with them so that whatever we are promoting is a shared benefit for both. In Uganda, again, the MenEngage group led the process of supporting the Ministry of Gender on the male engagement strategy. And they closed out as the stubborn feminists. We never saw that. And this male engagement strategy is now what is informing the government's work on GBV. And it has disturbing provisions that are saying many men are victims and their needs have been ignored, or services. I get so emotional when I talk about that, saying that all the services are working for women. That's not true. That's not true. So that victimhood competition and wrong representation is very problematic. And that's the reason if they do not listen to us and understand the challenges that may be coming from their seemingly innovative ideas, I think that's something that needs to be also deeply looked at. And also recognizing the gender hierarchy and striving to transform the system of hierarchies of negative power. As you were talking about the systems transformation, the structural transformation of all these oppressions and injustices, not just about, smaller actions. And now, of course, this means when accountability is in practice, it should be informing the kind of program approaches, what kind of analysis are being used to understand the problems of oppression. And then it will also inform the kind of programming, what kind of trajectory should it take? I think for me, these are really important things. And then, of course, prioritizing the principle of do no harm. Is there a mechanism to keep checking the harm that might be coming? Because sometimes the ideas are with good intentions, but once they are working out, could they be causing harm? And if there is harm being caused, is there mitigation action that is being taken on? And then, of course, finally, examining the funding decisions. If I give the example here in Uganda, many donors are quite excited when they hear MenEngage. They just keep funding groups that may not even be part of the MenEngage Secretariat, but they are just, oh, there are men here, they are doing wonderful things just because these people spoke words that sounded right. And then how they are going to do that work becomes another issue. And the donors maybe are pushing them to expand and go to scale without really transforming the communities and policies that they are working against. Over to you.
Wonderful, Tina. I so appreciate you hearing your words of caution there, and that is exactly what we can get on board with, and that we need to work towards. It is that kind of accountability, that kind of allyship, that kind of solidarity and working together that we strive for. And I think at any time, if any of the groups that we are connected with, regional networks, national networks, are not doing that, then it means that we have to do further work to support change in that way. I think, as Latanya mentioned, there are opportunities for allies to call out when injustices are being done. And in some cases to call in when we see that the wrong approach is being used, and there's an opportunity for us to engage and help to redirect that approach so that it's more accountable, so that it's individuals and organizations working it can be really on board with that end goal of promoting gender justice, gender equality for women and girls in particular, to address other systemic forms of oppression. I also want to say that in particular men must think really hard about their own journey before they proceed on to one of allyship. So I think addressing past errors, past harms, past experiences of discrimination, of oppression that they've committed towards others is important in that journey, and that must be done first and foremost. I also have seen that many allies make errors along the way and lose accountability in some cases, and in that particular case, it's important for allies to exit that journey and make amends and take accountability and make the necessary repairs to any harm that they've committed. And also towards the end of that journey, it's not sufficient to just say, I'm an ally, but then men need to become advocates for systemic and institutional change as well. So it's not about just individual actions and behaviors. It's also about using their privilege and affecting change and leveraging power that they're connected with towards that more broader and more systemic change as well. So it is a journey, but it is not a linear one. I would say it's a circular journey, and there needs to be exit opportunities along the way for men to pause, to think about their actions and to make amends as necessary, and to return to accountability. And I think it's on all of us, men in particular, to help hold those men accountable and call them in when we feel that there's an opportunity for that redirect to happen, call them out and really question their allyship if they're not willing to engage in that kind of change.
Thank you so much, the four of you. There's so much to take away, and also so many questions that I think we haven't addressed yet. And I do realize we're running out of time. So I will not do any further attempt to summarize. I want to ask you, though, in this last round, I first want to pass it to Alan, but in the meantime, think about this. Just in 1 or 2 sentences, for you, a key takeaway from this conversation for yourself and your own work, and to share a key giveaway for others here listening and those of us working specifically on the efforts to work with men and boys on eliminating patriarchy. Would love to hear from you. But first, Alan, any reflections from your side? Any questions for follow-up?
Well, there's a lot to sit with, right? Thanks, everyone. That was a fantastic discussion. Lots of great issues raised there. And I think that, the thing about how we move from rhetoric into action is the key one, right, for all those issues. I mean, I think of accountability as relationship. So I think we need to get better at having more difficult conversations with people who we are in relationship within the MenEngage Alliance. That calling people in and calling people out, their acts of relationship building. But sometimes that involves uncomfortable conversations, and I think we need to probably get better at doing that. I think there are ways in which the funding structures set us up against each other to compete against each other as well, which kind of breaks that sense of relationship. So that kind of movement building piece is very practical about how do we build stronger relationships and solidarity with each other. I think the piece about hurt people is really important, and thinking more about how we build our skills around trauma-informed work, not just with men, right, but for people of all gender identities and expressions. And there's a good discussion in the chat about how do we nurture resilience. And then I think this thing about accountability as well in terms of institution, there's a whole way in which impunity is institutionalized. So how do we really think about challenging institutionalized impunity? And I do think we need to be careful about getting sucked into kind of processes, where like we do masculinities training with the police, for example, as a way of dealing with police violence. I think there are some examples of where that work I think has been really interesting, Roseanne in Pakistan. But Minneapolis police apparently was renowned for its anti-bias training, right? But it was the Minneapolis police that killed George Floyd. So we need to be very careful about how masculinities work can get framed as a response to institutional problems, but in fact it's a way of kind of covering up those problems. So those would be the things that I'm sitting with. But thanks everyone. To be continued, right?
Yes, for sure. I felt this in every session, but I feel here like we really scratched the surface. But one of the key takeaways, and that's also really reflected in the chat, is that allyship is about action. And I think Alan also just summarized it. Beyond the rhetoric, beyond the principles, it's about what we actually do in practice. Do we show up? And I think relationship building is key in that. It's like showing up consistently, structurally, ongoingly, and that requires relationship building. And I think as MenEngage Alliance, we have a role to play in creating spaces where that is possible and supporting our membership to come into those spaces and into those relationships, into those conversations in ways that are really informed by the feminist principles that I think, Tina, you were mentioning also. It's not only about who shows up in the conversation, but actually what do they represent, and do we actually work from, act from, and deeply personally embed the feminist principles and reflections on our own. I think several of you the privileges that we hold. And that is key for MenEngage Alliance, because that is in essence who we work with and what we work on. It's to recognize privilege, to address privilege, and from that perspective, be an ally with those who are oppressed. And I think there was a lot of conversation around women and girls and recognizing violence against women and girls, and I would say against LGBTQI people. But for MenEngage, the perspective is also increasingly looking at oppression in broader sense, not only on the basis of gender. Several of you mentioned racism. I think there's a whole conversation around decolonizing our practices that we haven't yet gotten into so much during this conversation, but very important. I do want to mention it. So before rounding off, I would love to just do kind of that quick round, just some of your key takeaways in 1 or 2 sentences, if possible. And I'm just going to mix it up a little bit, so I'm just going to go the other way around, starting with you, Umberto.
Oh, great. I feel really hopeful. I think that there are opportunities for us to be bold and to do things differently. And I encourage us to do that. Let's kind of shake up the frameworks and the approaches, and let's find ways to work collaboratively, equitably, accountably, in new ways that don't kind of replicate the approaches of the past that in many cases have been very problematic. But let's also build up on the good work that's been done. And for me, the biggest thing is to build stronger cross social movement solidarity and allyship and collaboration. This is not just about ending sexism and patriarchy and misogyny. It's also about ending racism. It's also about ending colonialism, homophobia, and transphobia. Let's do better in working across those social movements. And I'm excited to continue working with all of you. And thank you, Tina, Kamani, and Latanya, and Alan for this opportunity. Really appreciate it.
And Tina, would love to hear from you.
For me, I think the whole takeaway for me is, I just like Umberto, I also feel hopeful that this is really a good grounding for the way forward, because if such internal reflections are touching some of the hard things that we from the other side have been raising, I think it's a good beginning, because then it's going to lead us hopefully to a shared understanding of how to move forward. So for me, that's a good takeaway for me. And a giveaway for me, of course, there's many, but I think if we get to that point of having a shared understanding of what accountability is and how to put that in practice going forward without waiting for feminists to chase, I think that will be a very good way to go forward. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Kamani.
Thank you. Yes, it's been lovely listening to everyone, and I truly appreciate this conversation. I think for me, the key takeaway has been the conversation around accountability and what does it look like. To me, it's always been like a bit of a gray area, and trying to always understand. And today, I saw a lot more of what it looks like and what it can look like, and how far there is to go still, because we say, yeah, let's be accountable, but then what again does it translate to? And I think it changes, it varies from level to level. And yeah, I think a lot of brainstorming still needs to happen, but as you all said, this is a great start. I think my giving is around this area that I do talk a lot about, around trauma-informed, perpetration of behavior and how it leads to perpetration of violence as a whole, not only within relationships, but also as a whole, because to me, it's all a continuum, but of course, with very unique aspects when it comes to women, when it comes to children. But not that it's a silver bullet, but I feel it plays an important role in this work. So yes, that's my feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. Latanya.
Thank you all. This has been an amazing opportunity to learn so much about MenEngage. And what I'm walking away with is this this thinking around our influence and our power and how we sit in that, and how we determine both for ourselves and for our organizations, personally and individually, how we show up and use that in space where we can follow and be good allies. Let's do that. We don't always have to lead on programs or policy interventions or advocacy. Often it may mean that we sit in our power, and I think, as Tina mentioned, listen to those that are most impacted and affected. And then also, just, as I think about the funding that we do at Global Fund for Women, encouraged by some of what I heard, because we've always done core grants, long-term grants, flexible grants. And I think this provides the opportunity for the connection that we're talking about, building relationships. It allows us to do so much more of what is needed within the context specifically, and where that holds us as we seek to have gender justice achievements around the world. So I, again, thank all of you for the work that you're doing, and hope that we can all show up for each other in our own power and influence. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've learned so much. We'll long reflect on what you've been sharing, and we'll also launch the video from this recording in a couple of days from now. I thank you so much, Latanya, Kamani, Tina, Umberto, for being here today. Also, thank you, Alan, for being with us in all of the 6 sessions, and of course for drafting the discussion paper and sharing your wisdom, your reflections with everybody. This series has come to an end. Of course, the Ubuntu Symposium has not yet, so do keep a look on the MenEngage website. And for those of you who are on the listservs, you will be receiving all the invitations of the ongoing sessions. We will keep having these sessions until the 22nd of June, when we will be having the MenEngage Ubuntu Symposium closing. And a lot of the knowledge that is being gathered here is being captured and will be informing all of our work going forward. So really appreciate you so much, to the speakers being here today and sharing your wisdom and your reflections. Thanks to the participants, and hope to see you again and on the next sessions. Thanks for today.